morning, everybody. I guess we can still call it morning. I wanted to follow up on the discussion I started last week about grief. I felt like even though it was just a little touching on the matter to go along with our 9/11 memorial services, it really wasn't enough to do justice to the subject. And so many people today are dealing with grieving losses that I wanted to make sure I covered the subject a little more clearly for those who are going through grief and those who have friends going through grief. It is an incredibly dark shadow. It's confusing. No one understands why they feel the way they do. And I wanted to go over the stages of grief and some ways to cope with grief or help others cope with grief. Understanding, however, you can't go around the valley of shadow of death. When you're grieving, the only way to the other side is to go through it, unfortunately. And it is a dark and cold and difficult road to follow. There are ways to help our friends and loved ones get through grief. There are ways to come out on the other side of it, not forgetting the person you've lost, but honoring their memory. And that's a goal. It's not a short-term goal, unfortunately. It is a long-term goal, but it can be done. So let's talk a little bit about the stages of grief. Unfortunately, when someone is grieving, they start to feel as though they're in the middle of a wilderness and there is no clear direction. The truth is, the stages of grief do not happen in a direct line. It's not as though you can check off a list. Well, I'm done with the shock phase, and now I'm going to go to sorrow, and then I'll be done, and I'll go to anger, and then I'll be done. And it doesn't really work that way. A lot of the stages will find people swinging back and forth as if they're in the middle of a storm, and they'll ride a swelling wave and then suddenly crash, and they'll have good days and bad days, and it can be very difficult to know if you're ever going to feel better, especially within the first year if it's someone who is very, very close to you. And I know this sounds like really bad news, but it is helpful for people to know when they're going through grief that those feelings are normal, that you're not crazy, that you should not feel as though there's something wrong with you. And that's something to always help your friends. Make sure that you know when you're reaching out to someone who's in grief that you don't have to make them feel like the grief is over. You should feel better now. That's not one of the things that we want to start bringing to someone who's freshly experiencing grief, especially. There are a lot of well-meaning people who will say things that are hurtful right after a loss, meaning to help. Things like, well, they're in a better place, or God needed another angel, or something along those lines, where that person is just had something very precious ripped from their heart as though it was a piece of their body that's missing now. The loss is felt so very, very deeply. So a better thing to say would be, I'm sorry. I know that you feel bad. Instead of trying to make them instantly feel better, which is really for the person who's reaching out, that's what we do to try to make ourselves feel better. We want you to feel better so I feel better. And really they're not going to feel better. There's nothing you can say that's going to make them feel as though that loss isn't there. But you can instead help validate their feelings where they are. Instead of saying, go ahead and cheer up, it'll be okay. Well, it's not going to be okay right away. It's going to hurt. It's going to feel awful. So the first stage a person is grieving, will experience, and this is very common, is shock. And I want to go through the stages so that you understand what the stages are, but keep in mind they don't go through a sequential order necessarily. The first stage is shock, and that's the brain's way of dealing with something it can't deal with all at once. You don't feel anything really. It feels surreal, as if this hasn't really happened. There's a numbness, and for someone who's close to the person they lost, that can last a little while. The shock, as soon as it begins to slowly settle in, the shock will turn to anger and sorrow, kind of a mix and back and forth between this deep, dark sense of sadness, of loss, even confusion and disorientation can happen during this, depression, and then it'll switch back and forth between this sorrow stage, where sometimes people either overeat or don't eat, and a stage of anger. That's when people are bargaining. If only we could have done this differently. If only I could have gone back and changed this wouldn't have happened. people want to feel as if they had power to change this. They don't like to feel helpless. So it's part of the human psyche's way of dealing with a loss is wanting to feel some kind of something, anything other than helplessness. And that's where anger comes in, bargaining. Why did this happen? Why couldn't it have happened differently? And an anger that this shouldn't have happened and it was an injustice. Those are normal feelings. And you'll see people in interviews with news media after a terrible tragedy or a homicide has occurred, and they will want justice. They'll want to see someone executed with the death penalty and feel as though that's justice. Yet, even after that happens, that person's loss is not alleviated. It's just part of the grieving process that someone wants to feel as though they have some kind of power over this situation when they really do not. And those things can happen back and forth. And for each individual, those stages will occur differently. Now the anger and the sorrow and the grief, those things can happen for a long, long time. They can happen for years, in fact. The hope is in grief not to forget the person you've lost, but to honor their memory and to create a new normal, to move on in a way that honors the impact that person has made on your life and in the world. Those are eventual goals, not to happen immediately after the death, but those are things that will help people move forward eventually. It's not something you bring to someone at the funeral. However, it's something that you can start building in after time. There are many different things that people will do that will help them move forward. Some people will plant a tree or a garden, and others will start a foundation or join a support group. Those things can be very, very helpful in honoring the memory of the person that's lost. Some people will create a memoir book about that person. Those are things that show that you are not forgetting, but you're honoring them in a way that shows that they deserve to have their life immortalized in a life-giving way. And that doesn't mean you'll never feel sad again, but eventually the hope is that the memories can be bittersweet. You can begin to remember good things and be happy and thankful for that person's life. That is an eventual goal, however. As a helper, as a friend, as a family member, it's important to understand that everyone goes through grief in different ways, expresses grief differently. Some people will be in an anger place. Some people will still be in shock. Others will be in sorrow, and it will look different. Some of those things will look like irritability against those that you normally would care about. So for those who are in families that are grieving a loss, please be mindful that your family members will express grief differently. The last thing that you want to get involved in is contention in the family over why you're not grieving the same way as other people in your family. So I wanted to offer some of those tips about grief for you today and give you some resources. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has a Stages of Grief wheel that you can refer to. It's easy to find on the internet. I will list some links to those diagrams on my website to help you out so you can identify specific feelings that you or your loved ones might be feeling during a time of grief. I also want to make sure that you know what a counselor's role would be if you went through counseling after a loss. A counselor's not going to make you feel immediately better, but they will help you learn to get through the grief, to cope with the grief. They will also help you with that process of creating a new normal in which you're able to honor the memory, not forget them, but move forward in a healthy way. And I hope that's helpful to you, and I hope that you have a blessed and wonderful week. Be encouraged.